Alright, we are back to Flappy Bird, and we're ready to finish up this game. A word of warning first. This lesson might be a little hard, but we also learned some smart things along the way. So if you're not too comfortable taking this hard video, just leave the score display to be what you're seeing here on the screen, and make the score sprite hidden. Otherwise, if you're brave enough to follow me, I have some cool stuff in this video. There's one more thing that we haven't even touched in this chapter, and that is keeping track of scoring. So if I hide out these variables by checking out these boxes, you'll see this sprite is left up, which is the sprite that will allow us to display the score as we're playing the game. So let's go program these now. So click on the score sprite, and let's add a when flag clicked block. So when the flag is clicked, I would like the sprite to start up right over here in the top left part of the screen. So I'm going to go to motion and bring in this go to block, and I'm going to set X to -200 and Y 150, something like that. All right. Then I would like to make this a little bit smaller. So just like we did with the other sprites, I'm going to set its size to 50%. So set size to 50%. And I'm also going to hide it, because right when we start up the game, we wouldn't like the score to show up. Good. Now, when the sprite receives the start game message, which happens when we click the start button, we would like the score to fade into the screen. All right. So when we start the game, Flappy is free to jump and fall to the ground, and the score makes sense to appear on the screen again. So let me add that. I'm going to go to events, and I'm going to bring in this when I receive block, and I'm going to select the start game message. So when I receive start game, then I'm going to switch the costume of the sprite back to 0. So notice the sprite has a number of costumes for all the digits that we can display on the screen. So I'm going to go to looks, and I'm going to switch costume to 0. All right. Then I'm going to set its transparency effect to 100% and then make it fade into the screen. So I'm going to set the ghost effect to 100. So starting from completely transparent, and I'm going to make it less transparent, so fade into. All right. So I'm going to bring in the control block, and over 10 repetitions, I'm going to change the transparency effect by a negative number, so make it less transparent. All right. So I'm going to change the ghost effect by -10. All right. Now, because the sprite is originally hidden, I would also like to show it. So I'm going to bring in the show block right below when I receive start game. So if I hit the flag now, notice that the score sprite has disappeared, and if I hit the start button, it will fade into the stage. This is exactly what I wanted. All right. Now, when Flappy crashes, I would like the score to fade out of the screen, and also maybe reset the score back to 0. All right, so I'm going to add another script starting with when I receive, and I'm going to select new game. So remember, new game is broadcast when Flappy crashes into either the obstacles or the ground. So I'm going to make this sprite fade out. So over repeat 10, I'm going to change the ghost effect by a positive value. So I'm going to go to looks, and I'm going to bring in the change effect, and I'm going to select ghost, and I'm going to put in 10 here. So I'm going to make the sprite fade out, become increasingly transparent until it becomes fully transparent. All right. And I'm also going to set score back to 0. Right? There's no other sprite that will set the score back to 0 at a new game. So I'll just make this sprite in charge of that. All right, so this is good. Now, the most important part of the programming of this score sprite is how to program it to increase its costume, so change its digit costumes as the score increases. So remember, the pipe broadcasts a score point message when it passes the position of Flappy. So we'll need to make the score sprite react to the score point message. So I'm going to go here into the open space and I'm going to add a new script starting with when I receive score point. So when I receive score point, I would like to set the costume number of the sprite depending on what the value of the score is. So I'm going to go to looks and I'm going to switch costume to, and inside I'm going to bring in the operators section and I'm going to bring in this circle plus operator, and in the first space I'm going to bring in score, and in the second space I'm going to write 1. So I'm setting the costume number to be score plus 1. Now why do I do that? Well, if you notice, the score equals 0, so that is the costume representing digit 0, is actually costume number 1. So this is the first costume. Digit number 1 is costume number 2. Digit 2 is actually costume number 3. So this is the third digit, and so on and so forth. So we will always need to switch the costume number to score plus 1. So let's see if this works. I'm going to click on the flag. So at this point, score should reset back to 0, and notice that it displays as such. But when I score my first point, the costume doesn't increment. We need to fix that. Now the problem is pretty hard to figure out, and I'm going to explain this. So notice that the pipe sprite broadcasts score point, but it doesn't actually increase the score itself. The one who increases the score point is Flappy. So Flappy increases the score as a reaction to the score point broadcast. So when the pipe sprite broadcasts score point, the Flappy sprite actually changes the score, and the score sprite switches its costume. But which one of these scripts happens first? Well, that's exactly the problem. If you have two scripts that are executed at the same time, you have no control over which one gets finished first. So that by the time Flappy actually increments the score, it might very well be that the score sprite has already finished switching its costume. So we need to change the order of operations. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Flappy and I'm going to delete this block, this orange block that changed score by 1, and move it into where it came from. And I'm going to go to the pipe sprite and I'm going to bring in the change block, and I'm going to change score by 1, and I'm going to put it right before broadcasting score point. So when the pipe is ready to broadcast the score point, it has already changed the score by 1. It has already incremented the score, so that the score sprite is already able to switch its costume. So let's play again. Hitting the flag and hitting the start button. The score is right at 0, and let me score my first point. Good. So the score is now handled properly. Now the next problem with scoring is what happens when you pass 9, so when you get to 10. Let me bring in some blocks to the open space. So I'm going to set score to 0 and change the score by 1 alongside broadcasting score point. So much like what the pipe sprite does. And I'm going to click these blocks to trigger the broadcasting of the score point message. I'm also going to go to variables and check this box with the score just to make sure we have the correct value for the score variable. So I'm going to set the score to 0, and then I'm going to click this block. So I've scored a point. The score is equal to 1, and this sprite has the costume appropriate to the score equals 1. And if I click this a bunch of times, then the score sprite will update its costume. But if I get to 9, notice what's happening if I click this again. The score is 10, but the score sprite has reverted its costume back to 0. Well, why is that? Because I'm switching its costume to score plus 1. Well, score plus 1 is 11, but there is no 11th costume in the score sprite. We only have 10. So we need to create another digit on the stage, which means creating a clone. So I'm going to go to control and I'm going to bring in the if block and put it right below the switching costume. Now I'm going to move these little blocks a little away, and in the diamond shaped block I'm going to bring in an operator saying if the score is bigger than 9. So I'm going to right click on the rounded score block and I'm going to duplicate it here. So if the score is bigger than 9, then I've passed the 10 mark, so I need to create a clone. So I'm going to go to control and I'm going to create clone of myself. Now, what is the clone supposed to do? Well, let's program it. So when I start as a clone, I'm going to go to some position on the screen. So I'm going to bring in this go to block, and instead of -200, I'm going to put in a slightly less negative value. So I'm going to put in -185. All right, so the second digit will bring in onto the stage a little bit to the right from the original sprite. And then I'm going to switch its costume back to 0. So let's see what's happening now. If I set the score back to 0 and I click this block, we have score equals 1. And let's try to bypass 9. So I have 9 and I click this again. We have 2 sprites with the costume 0, 0. And if I click this again, we have only 1 changing its costume, which is the wrong sprite. We need to fix that, especially since if we have some ginormous score like 362 and we have 3 clones on the stage, if we increase the score by 1, then only one of the sprites, in this case the last clone, will need to change its costume. But that's not the only case. If we have, for example, 399, and if we increase the score of that, then all of the clones plus the original sprite will have to change its costume. So this is pretty hard. We need some sort of smart way to make each clone plus the original sprite to change the costumes appropriately. So here's what I'm going to do to solve that. I'm going to go to variables and I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to name this digit position. And very importantly, I'm going to check this for this sprite only checkbox. And I'm going to hit OK. So every single score sprite, so the original score sprite plus the clones, will have their own value for this digit position variable. And what this variable means is that each clone and the original sprite will remember their position in the whole number that represents the score. So the original sprite will have this digit position equal to 1 because it's the first digit. The first clone will have digit position equals 2 because it's the second digit in the score. The third clone will have digit position equals 3 because it's the third digit in the score, and so on and so forth. So that's what this digit position variable is going to mean. So how do we program this digit position thing? Well, when I receive new game, alongside setting the score to 0, I'm going to set this digit position to 1. And I'm going to delete all the clones on the stage, and I will leave only the original sprite. So I'm going to go to control and I'm going to bring in delete this clone. So if we have multiple clones of this score sprite on the stage, all of them will receive new game. All of them will set the score to 0, which is harmless. All of them will set their digit position to 1, which is harmless. All of them will fade out, and all of them except the original sprite will be deleted from the stage. So this part is fine. Now, where else do we need to set this digit position or to change it? Well, we need to set that digit position when the clone starts. So when the clone starts, that means a new digit is being added to the stage. This is the only moment when it makes sense to start a new clone. And that's also the only moment when it makes sense to set its digit position variable. So I'm going to go to variables and set its digit position to a value. Well, what is that value going to be? Well, it's going to be the number of digits from the score, because when a clone starts, then that means the number of digits from the score has increased. So we need to set its digit position to the number of digits of the score. Well, the number of digits in the score is easily retrievable by this rounded length of block. And inside this space, I'm going to get into variables and I'm going to bring in score. So the digit position is going to be length of score. That means the number of digits in the score. So normally at the start of the game, we only have the original sprite, right? So when the score is equal to 9 and we go from score 9 to score 10, then the original sprite will create a clone. Remember? Now, when the clone starts, the score is equal to 10. So the length of score is 2. That's the number of digits. So the digit position of this new clone will be 2. Now, when we have the original sprite and one clone, and we have score equals 99, so 99, and we move from 99 to 100, then that means we'll need a third clone. So the original sprite will create a third clone, and when the clone starts, the digit position of that is going to be length of score. Now, if score is equal to 100, length of score is 3. So the third clone will have its digit position equal to 3. So we are fulfilling our promise in that the digit position of the original sprite is 1, and every single other clone has its digit position increasing. So I hope that makes sense. Now, because we might have multiple clones on the stage, they can't all sit in the same position because that will mean overlapping our digits. So we need to change this x coordinate depending on what the digit position is. So I'm going to devise a little formula here. I'm going to go to operators and I'm going to bring in the plus operator. And in the first space, I'm going to put in negative 200, which is the x position of the original sprite. Remember at the beginning, we set the original sprite to x equals negative 200. All right. Now in the second space, I will need to implement a small mathematical formula that will position each clone depending on what its digit position is. So I'm going to put in the multiplication operator, and I'm going to pick 15 here for the first space. And in the second space, I'm going to bring in digit position minus 1. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what this means in a second. So I'm going to put in digit position minus 1. So I acknowledge this is quite hard, but let me try making this a little easier. Instead of negative 200, I'm going to put in 0 here. And I'm going to make the original sprite go to x equals 0 instead of negative 200. So right at the center of the stage from the horizontal perspective. All right. So I'm going to snap this back. So 0 plus whatever means whatever's on the right hand side of the plus operator, right? So it's basically 15 times digit position minus 1. Now every clone will be placed differently depending on its digit position. The bigger digit position is, the further to the right it's going to get placed. And this formula specifies how. The first clone will be placed 15 points to the right of the original sprite, the second clone 30 points to the right of the original sprite, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to snap this formula here onto the X space. All right, we've done a lot of work. Let's take a tiny break and let's continue in the next video.